Raf, thanks very much for joining me. And first of all, you talk about it at the start of the book, and I was slightly surprised that it took someone else to tell you that women in cricket should be your research specialty.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was serendipity, perhaps, because I do tell this story in the introduction to the book that actually it was when I was an undergraduate and I was playing cricket a bit, kind of playing properly for the first time, and was late to a meeting with my final year dissertation supervisor because I'd been hit in the face with the cricket ball. Because I wasn't a very good cricketer, and I like to think that I'm a better writer about cricket than I ever was a player of cricket. Anyway, and we were trying to decide on a topic for my dissertation. And she sort of, when I turned up with this cricket ball shaped bruise on my face, she sort of took one look at me and said, "Oh, well, have you thought about looking at the history of cricket in girls' schools?" And then I went away and realised there was this huge kind of gap in research on the history of all women's and girls' cricket. So yeah, it was kind of suggested to me by somebody else, and maybe if I'd never been hit in the face with the ball, then it would never have happened. I can't say that that was a particularly pleasant experience, but it has led me in a really exciting direction and enabled me to do the research and tell the stories and publish this book. So that's a nice outcome.
So, tip for anyone: don't practice your catching, and a lifelong researcher and career will be born. And in terms of this book specifically, in a sense, there's sort of no bad time for this book to have come out because, as you say, there sort of hasn't really been a book like it with this scope and written by someone who actually knows how to research. How did the getting this book out and getting it out now come about?
Well, I think that I always knew this was going to be a huge year for women's cricket, and I do feel like we say that a lot now with women's cricket. It's
Every
because
major
every
tournament,
year,
right?
exactly. Every year is a bigger year than before, which is really exciting, and it's a great time to kind of be involved in women's cricket and be writing about women's cricket. But I think kind of summer 2026 in England, it's this kind of the perfect storm of having a home World Cup directly followed by the first ever women's test at Lord's. And that Lord's test is going to be a kind of deeply historic occasion and a deeply historic moment, and a real time to sort of kind of look back and appreciate how far we've come. It's also happens to be the centenary year of the formation of the Women's Cricket Association, who are a kind of a real it's an organisation that features very centrally in the book because they ran women's cricket in England between 1926 and 1998 when the ECB took over running things. So yeah, all of those things kind of coming together, it just felt like this would be a good year to release the book because I actually started writing it in lockdown, believe it or not, which is quite a while ago now. And I was at a little bit of a loose end, and I thought, well, what can I do? I know I'll kind of gather together all of the interviews I've done, all of the research I've done, and put it all in a book. And then it sort of sat on my desk for a little while until I was able to find the right publisher, Pitch, who have been brilliant, and also, yeah, it just felt like this was a good time to bring it out.
You mentioned that Lord's Test. I'm going to be there on day one. Can't wait. That's sort of a good place to start in terms of one of the overall themes of this book is how. So I've also somewhat recently read your Guardian colleague Suzy Wrack's book about moving the goalposts about the history of English women's football, and that is very much a story of English women's football getting really mainstream and really popular to the point where the FA shut it down for 50 years. It's not quite the same with English women's cricket, and we've had the 150th men's test finishing earlier this week or late last week. We're finally getting the first women's test. English women's cricket has, for better or for worse, been a completely sort of separate entity to men's cricket in England.
Exactly. It was run by separate organisations until relatively recently, until 1998, and then of a kind of international level, we have the International Women's Cricket Council set up in 1958. which I do talk about quite a lot in the book because they were a significant organisation run completely separately to the ICC. The members would kind of meet together and figure out kind of basically what the touring schedule was going to look like for women's cricket, how they might try and negotiate funding within their individual national context. And the IWCC ran international women's cricket until the ICC took over in 2005. So it is a distinct history to the men's game. It has some kind of individual quirks. So, for example, one of the founder members of the IWCC were the Netherlands, who are about to play in their first T20 World Cup, but do have a very strong history in women's cricket, much more so than they do in men's cricket. So I think that's one of the reasons I'd kind of urge people to read the book, is because women's cricket has its own history and kind of deserves to be recognised for that, distinctively. But I think it's really interesting that you mentioned Suzy Wrack's book and the history of women's football, because there are some kind of quite important differences. Obviously, women trying to play cricket are still subject to ridicule, and there's still some very influential men, notably W.G. Grace, who are very anti-women's cricket. But importantly, women's cricket is never banned in the way that women's football is. And actually, what the Women's Cricket Association try really hard to do is to almost separate themselves from a sport like women's football and to kind of deliberately position themselves as being respectable. And they are very conscious, I think, of what happened with the FA ban, because that's 5 years before the Women's Cricket Association sets itself up. And therefore, they are, they take a very kind of softly approach with an institution like the MCC, and they try to say, well, we're going to play in skirts, for example, because we're women playing like women, and we're no threat to you whatsoever. If we could just have a little bit of help every now and again, that would be very nice. And they do get a very little bit of help every now and again from MCC. So, for example, the first post-war women's cricket tour, England go to Australia and New Zealand in 1948-49, and the MCC actually gives them £250, which in the 1940s was a not insubstantial sum of money. But the minutes actually show that there's a bit of a row within the WCA, because some members say, but the MCC are really rich. Why can't they give us more money? So there's kind of always a bit of a debate going on about the extent to which the WCA should actually more forcefully challenge some of the kind of some of the norms around cricket, and actually more forcefully go to MCC and say, look, you're doing a little bit for us, can you do a bit more? But obviously, that's one of the reasons why it takes so many decades for women to get their first match at Lord's, for example, which happens in 1976, 50 years ago, because they don't want to push the issue, actually. So I think that there's almost an extent to which women's cricket is trying to avoid the fate of women's football.
I didn't want to get onto her this early, but it's sort of impossible not to, from the 60s right through to, I mean, in your book, the 90s particularly. Kind of no one really encapsulates that battle between pushing ahead versus what you might call respectability politics better than Rachael Heyhoe Flint. Your book, we heard a lot in the latter years of her life when she becomes a baroness, and then after her passing, I remember listening to her son on Test Match Special talking about her and everything she did to get the 1973 World Cup off the ground, and befriending Jack Hayward. Very strange man. I fell down a wonderful Wikipedia rabbit hole looking at his Wikipedia page. Very, very odd man, cartoon Englishman. But your book goes into detail about some of the things that she got wrong. She was certainly in my view, pretty consistently wrong on apartheid. The story of her trying to get the West Indies kicked out of the Men's World Cup in '83 is bonkers. And also, the fact that the Women's Cricket Association almost felt there's a number of instances where they're almost having to sort of clean up after her or sort of apologise for her. Rachael Heyhoe Flint is one of the people who's in women's cricket whose story is better known than most. But was there anything that, looking into her story, that you found surprising or that changed your view of her and her role?
What I've tried to do is to make the conversation around her a little bit more nuanced, I suppose. And also, what I think is really important is that she is very well known. And whenever somebody talks about the history of women's cricket, they almost equate it with Rachael Heyhoe Flint because she was this incredible kind of larger than life character. She had this huge kind of media presence. And she did all of this TV work, for example, and really got women's cricket into the public eye. In a way that it really needed, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And of course, the campaign for women to become female members of MCC, that was a battle that she very much spearheaded in the 1990s and forced them to debate the issue, which was really important. So that kind of gung-ho approach did yield really important progress. But there's also a sense in which there were lots of other women working really hard within the WCA and doing it in a much quieter way. And sometimes that did yield more effective, more immediate results. So a great example is that first women's match at Lord's in August 1976. And I go into quite a lot of detail about this in the books. I think it's really interesting because most people, when they talk about that, they talk about it in the same breath as the 73 World Cup, and they go, and it was both of them happened because of Rachael Heyhoe Flint. The 73 World Cup is much more, yes, it's a Rachael Heyhoe Flint project because she befriends Jack Hayward, she charms Jack Hayward, and she manages to persuade him to stump up all of this money, 40 grand in 1973 to bring all of these women's teams to England. So that's very much her project, although there are lots of other people kind of doing the grunt work as well, and, figuring out where are these teams going to stay, what are they going to do while they're in England. That was the point at which you still had to put on a full social program for teams because you were the hostesses. And they were kind of coming to visit the country, not just to play cricket. They were also being offered this broader experience. But to move on to 1976, then, the WCA at this point have gone to MCC again and said, please, for like the 20th time of asking approximately, please, might we have a match at Lord's? And because of the success of the 73 World Cup, the MCC are now seriously considering this. Partly because they've been absolutely kind of rounded on by the media, who have gone, well, why on earth wasn't the first Cricket World Cup played at Lord's, World Cup final played at Lord's? That doesn't make any sense. And of course, the answer was, well, they asked it to be, and MCC said no. Anyway, so the WCA are actually in this kind of negotiation process that's going on very quietly over a long period of many months. And eventually they get to a point where MCC say, yeah, okay, yeah, we think we might try and make the ground available for you to have a one-day international in the summer of 1976. And it makes sense for it to be England v Australia because that's the sort of really enduring rivalry in women's cricket, just as it is the men's game. What does Rachael Heyhoe Flint do? Well, at the end of 1975, she's chatting to a journalist and she says this is a joke, but it's reported seriously in the newspapers that she's going to sue MCC for not letting the England women's cricket team play at Lord's. So she actually kind of, waves this legal threat in front of them. And they're really angry about it. And it basically almost destabilises the negotiation. So the WCA then have to kind of go cap in hand to MCC and say, we're so sorry about this. We really need to distance ourselves from Rachael Heyhoe Flint. We didn't know that she was going to do this. Please, can we still have Lords for this match? So Sylvia Swinburne, the WCA president, goes and visits the MCC secretary, and it's reported in the MCC minutes that after this very nice visit and this very nice apology, MCC have decided that it would be appropriate for the women to have a match there. So actually, then Rachael Heyhoe Flint gets to lead England women out for the first time at Lord's and kind of be part of this really iconic moment. But it nearly didn't happen, partly because of her kind of very gung-ho approach to the sort of gender politics of the situation. That's just an example of how sometimes the slightly gentler approach worked, but also the fact that who's heard the name Sylvia Swinburne before, but without Sylvia Swinburne there wouldn't have been a match at Lord's in August 1976.
The impression I got reading the the book is, and one of the things I love about this book is how kind of many associations and how it makes you. I very rarely make notes when I'm reading a book, even when I'm about to interview someone about it. But I've got pages and pages of notes in this notebook and like pencil margins in this fine paperback, which I don't think I've done since I left school. But I'm going to quote from the secretary reported that he had received a very pleasant letter from the Women's Cricket Association dissociating themselves, etc., and so on. The WCA wished to apologise for any embarrassment that had been caused. The MCC had felt that it would be a suitable gesture to offer up Lords, and there's a real theme of, I say the early book, but really even into the 90s and the battle for, you know, more appropriate sporting clothing and professionalism in any form, even more than English men's cricket. English women's cricket in those early days is a real preserve, and deliberately so, certainly on an official level, of the upper to middle class and a very specific slice of society. And I think, now you quote the ICEC report at the end of the book, and how the issues of access and of a certain gatekeeping of what cricket should look like are even more acute in women's cricket than they are in men's cricket in England. It's sort of, to what extent is English women's cricket still sort of struggling with that legacy of being initially a game for the respectable gentry and even aristocracy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that women's cricket struggles with this in the same way that men's cricket does, actually. And I hope
cricket sport of the gentry, and then it gets invented as a sport because of rich people betting on it, and as a colonial product. Shock. In other news, Pope Catholic.
Exactly. I hope that one of the things I've tried to do in the book is be reasonably balanced between really celebrating the Women's Cricket Association and their achievements, because after all, they were trying to run for the best part of 100 years, trying to run this sport kind of on a shoestring with not really any financial help, very limited means, and they were doing very radical things, like organising international women's cricket matches. And one of the kind of key things that they did was put women's cricket in the public eye. So they organised public women's matches, invited people to come along, and basically challenged them, and kind of almost said, well, you think women's cricket's rubbish, but why don't you come and see it? And so what they were doing was very radical. But you're right that and particularly kind of post Second World War, then women's cricket does become this quite socially limited, and certainly like very white sport as well. And we're still really feeling the effects of that. One of the kind of big problems that women's cricket is always grappling with is that is in order to kind of play for England at a time when the sport is totally amateur and there's no money at all, you have to have means to do that. So if you're going to pay thousands of pounds originally for your boat fare to Australia, and also take, originally it's like 5 months away from work, then if you're working class, you're not going to be able to do that, really. And
you've got to buy all your own clothing and pay for yourself when you're out there. And
exactly. So there's all kinds of challenges that presents. There's obviously also the we talk about kind of the dying out of boys cricket in state schools, particularly becoming a problem in the 1980s. Well, for kind of girls cricket, that's like a perpetual issue, because kind of in the 19th century, it's the big, rich public schools for girls that kind of get founded in the later 19th century that first take up cricket, and then they're the ones that kind of then produce this pipeline of cricketers who then kind of leave school and are good enough at cricket to then to play and to play as adult women and to kind of go on and represent England, etc. So you've got an issue in terms of like the lack of girls cricket in state schools from a much earlier kind of point than you do with boys, I think. So that's an issue. And then, in the racial politics of the Women's Cricket Association are quite problematic. There is a lot of, when the IWCC sets itself up, for example, they have this first ever meeting in January 1958 in Melbourne, and the founder members are England, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Netherlands. So it's basically like it's an all-white organisation, and it's the inclusion of the Netherlands slightly kind of there's some nuance to just saying, well, it's a sort of imperial organisation of England and the sort of the Dominion countries as they were known, but also that definitely feeds into the kind of conversations that are had. So that first meeting, they talk about apartheid. I think they refer to it as the colour bar. So there's a little bit of kind of talking around it, and the language is quite interesting. But they basically say, oh, we're a bit worried that this might be an issue in terms of sort of sending teams to South Africa. But like, oh, well, we just need to be really careful to kind of keep politics out of the IWCC. So it echoes a lot of the conversations that people try to have around men's cricket, of just saying, oh, well, going to play cricket in apartheid South Africa isn't political because sport isn't political, when obviously we know that that's nonsense. And then things like they have this idea that that South Africa are going to host the second Women's Cricket World Cup in 1977, at a point where in men's cricket everyone's already woken up and gone, no, actually, whatever our personal feelings about this are, the sort of politics of it are so problematic at this point that we can't do that. But the IWCC sort of try and cling on to this a little bit longer, and the WCA are very much sort of at the forefront of that. And there are a lot of kind of women's rebel tours to South Africa in the late 70s and in the early 80s, and the only reason that those tours kind of come to an end is because the WCA eventually realised that they're going to get into trouble, or that they're going to start becoming kind of isolated, because so in 1983 England are meant to go to the Caribbean on tour. And 2 days before the tour is about to go ahead, some of the Caribbean governments realise that some of the tourists who are going, some of the English tourists, have played in South Africa, and they go, well, we're just cancelling the tour, and the tour gets cancelled. And the WCA realised at that point that actually we can't let these rebel tours continue. But again, that's the point at which Rachael Heyhoe Flint gets involved, and is really quite annoyed about this, and says, well, I think that sport and politics are separate, and if we don't go to South Africa, then women's cricket in South Africa is going to die. It's all of these kind of familiar arguments, and there's actually a huge, like, very stormy AGM of the WCA I think it's in 1985, and unfortunately Rachael Heyhoe Flint can't be present because she's on holiday in South Africa, which is just like, the irony is not lost on me. And so but she sends this statement remotely, and then she ends up actually resigning from the WCA because she disagrees with their eventual stance on South Africa, although it took them quite a long time to get there. So, we still are feeling the legacies of that in terms of, if you look at the England women's cricket team, it's very white. You look at a lot of the new professional women's county teams, they are very white. They are not representative of the kind of diverse population of this country, and that's a concern, and it was noted by the ICEC, and it's something that I think we can get carried away and say, oh, women's cricket's wonderful and the history of women's cricket is all about exciting progress, and it is, but it's also it's not a kind of panacea of everything's brilliant because there are problems with the way that the women's game develops just as much as there are with the men's.
Yeah, you say it explicitly towards the end of the book that progress is not linear. Um, you you mentioned a few of them. There's a real sort of theme of the early pioneers of women's cricket, certainly in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I'm thinking people like Molly Hyde, Netta Reinberg, Betty Archdale, and others who start out as, in the context of the time, pretty radical figures who become, I mean, in some cases, those are sort of politically conservative big C and small c personalities, but become very conservative, almost reactionary figures later on, and astonishing quotes about people wearing shorts, or the story of a player supposedly not being able to tour because she dyed her hair blue, and that you note the real kind of, and I suppose all organizations, particularly sort of small to medium sized organizations, struggle with generational turnover. And like, as anyone who's ever been at a cricket club AGM, when someone who's been there for 45 years finally decides they've had enough of doing everything and no one paying attention, those are real tricky transition moments. And I'd like you to talk more about that kind of, that sort of slow generational transition that English women's cricket has in the 20th century, and at a time when not all, but certainly the sort of popular culture face of what it means to be a woman, and particularly a young woman in England, is transforming.
I talk about that a lot in the chapter on the 1960s, and I think it's a really good point that when these sort of pioneering women are setting up the Women's Cricket Association in the late 1920s, they are young women. They are kind of in their 20s, maybe early 30s.
I mean, one of them is a member of the Rational Dress League and an actual suffragist, I think, not suffragette.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Frances Heron Maxwell was a real. Yeah, she campaigned for women to have the vote, and was kind of radical for that generation. But then those same women are still running the Women's Cricket Association by the time you get into the 60s. And at that point, British society is fundamentally shifting. And there's all kinds of elements to this, pop music, kind of, more liberal attitudes towards things like sex, and all of these kind of quite radical shifts.
The cultural invention of the teenager.
Yeah, absolutely. And the women by that stage, it's the same women who are running the WCA, suddenly become quite uncomfortable with this. And women's cricket really kind of then almost it shrinks because it struggles to embrace this new kind of sort of type of like modernity, or new kind of more like, I don't know, like a more mini-skirt-esque culture.
More room for sort of individual self-expression.
Yeah, exactly. But they're all still obsessed with, well, is your skirt, more than 3 inches from the ground when kneeling to play cricket? And there are, there's all kinds of things in the Women's Cricket Magazine, which is this sort of publication that the WCA produces, about, young or teenage girls turning up to the cricket club to play cricket in shorts. How dare they? It's outrageous. Or trousers, which are just equally as appalling. And you're kind of going, but well, hang on, but you actually need this new generation of girls to kind of come through in order to be the cricketers of the future, the next generation. But they can't seem to sort of see that, and that's why, by the 1980s you get to a point where there's, I don't know, like 50 women's cricket clubs, less than that, in England and Wales, and it's, women's cricket's really, really, really struggling, and struggling for public awareness, struggling to get new players in, it's this thing of like, well, I was a pioneer, And now I'm not. Now I'm looking at young people going, hang on, the ground shifted under my feet and I can't quite deal with this. So, yeah, there are, women's cricket has a problem with that, I think, kind of particularly post Second World War.
You mentioned some of the people who helped turn it around, like Ruth Prideaux and her team, bringing in sports psychologists and bringing in sort of at least professional attitudes, if not professional pay. But how does that turn around? Because the point you get to in the 60s and 70s is quite a bleak one.
Yeah. It is, yeah. There's a report from the UK Sports Council, which is this sort of kind of government quango that's in charge of sport, that actually says women's cricket is basically dying. It's almost dead already, and it's a really really serious situation that it gets to. How does it kind of climb out of that? I think that there are kind of women who almost like pioneer a new approach to playing in spite of what they're being told by the WCA. So somebody like a Jeanette Britton, who is this like incredible batter, and the best batter in the world in the sort of late 80s, 90s. Very much kind of a bit ahead of her time in both in terms of her batting style, but also in terms of the fielding that she's trying to do. And that's important because if you're diving around in the field, which Jeanette Britton is really doing much more of than anybody else, then you can imagine that actually wearing a skirt then becomes more of a hindrance than anything else. And when they go on tour to India, she's diving around so much that her legs get infected because she's got all of these like scabs on her legs, and that's the point at which the England team, not the WCA leadership, but the England team go, we're not having this anymore. We don't think it's appropriate for us to be playing international cricket in skirts. And there's a huge battle in the mid 1990s amongst between the England team and some of the WCA stalwarts. And they have to fight really hard. And eventually they get a concession from the WCA that the England team can play in trousers. And so Charlotte Edwards, who makes her England debut at Guildford in 1996, plays one season of cricket, of international cricket in a skirt, and then the next year is able to move into trousers. So there are still a few photos of Lottie doing the rounds in her skirt, but it wasn't for very long. But I mean, that's 1997. It's just ridiculously recent to transition into trousers. And even then, it's only the England team who are allowed to do that. Individual clubs still have to kind of fight that battle themselves. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the things that happens is actually there's a little bit of a movement by the England team themselves to go, hang on a minute, we're not quite buying into some of your conservative ideas about dress anymore. And the other thing that they're increasingly not buying into is the WCA's ideas about amateurism. So one of the arguments that I make is that when men's cricket abolishes its amateur professional divide in 1962, and basically goes professional, that women's cricket then almost takes up the amateur mantle. And there's a lot of
sort of seeing itself as a defender of the old way.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of journalists who write lovely things, lovely patronising things about women's cricket in the late 60s and 70s, basically saying, oh, this is what men's cricket used to be like. Isn't it nice that they're still doing it purely for love and they're not worried about money. But by the 80s, if you're an England player, a lot is being demanded of you. And you're still not allowed to take any individual player payment. So the WCA are really anti-sponsorship, first of all. So there's actually occasions where in the 1950s, some sponsor turns up and says, I'll give all of the team free skirts. And the WCA say, no, that's against our principles. We couldn't possibly accept. There's then this huge battle with Rachael Heyhoe Flint, who is way more radical and is like, well, I'm playing cricket for my country. Why on earth shouldn't I kind of actually potentially make a bit of money out of it, or even just cover my costs? But the WCA aren't having any of it. So Gray Nichols market this Heyhoe bat in 1968. And the idea is obviously that the proceeds, some of the proceeds of that will go to Rachael Heyhoe Flint. And the WCA say, no, you have to pay that money into the West Midlands WCA bank account. I'm sorry, that's unacceptable. So that's a row that then rumbles on throughout the 70s and is eventually potentially one of the reasons why they fire her as England captain in 1977. But by the 80s, a lot more of the England team are, they're having to go through fitness testing. They're having to, devote a lot of time to training. And the WCA are still trying to say, oh no, none of you can accept individual sponsorship or even any kind of individual payment. That's against our principles. And finally, in 1988, the WCA changes its mind and says, okay, fine, we accept that. Things have moved on. But I mean, even so, there's a lot of people still in the WCA saying, no, this is wrong. In my day, we just played because we loved it and it was wonderful, and really mourn this kind of the dying of the amateur way of life. And of course, there are no fully professional contracts for the England women's cricket team until 2014. But increasingly, players, if they're offered individual sponsorship, they are able to accept it. And there is also increasingly a move for the WCA to try to kind of offer some kind of recompense when England players are having to go on tour and not work for several weeks at a time.
We talked a bit earlier about the sort of whether it's deliberate or not doesn't really matter because it was basic the exclusionary nature of how the WCA ran itself and how it saw English cricket, and the amateur insistence definitely plays into that. But I want to. You mentioned professionalism, and I remember the conversations around that 2014 test on Wormsley is a lovely ground, but it is not a test match venue. Let's be real. Egg the Bisht bowling 25 mile an hour at the stumps, slow left arm from a foot off the ground, and no one can get it off the square. I remember the anger almost after England lost that test of, well, we've given you contracts and you should win. That sort of sense of almost anger and entitlement. That journey to professionalism, and there's a couple of great quotes from the Times journalist Alan Lee in there talking about it after the '93 World Cup, and Karen Smithies goes on every talk show known to humanity, talking about this like now is the time to capitalise, in the same way that I remember the conversations about the Lionesses after 2022 or the Red Roses or even England after the 2017 World Cup. And then he writes later talking about it as a missed opportunity. That journey to professionalism and coming at the same time as the governance merger, which I know you're not 100% a fan of, put it that way, is a very complicated story.
Yeah, it is complicated for all kinds of reasons. It's complicated because somebody like Claire Connor at ECB has to fight really hard to defend the idea that the England women's cricket team deserve contracts. And
by the way, she's not got a seat on the board or anything.
No, she is. She's kind of one of the only women within the entire organisation. So when she joined the ECB at the start of 2008, she's basically she is women's cricket at ECB, and she's having to sort of deal with all of these different things, and actually really kind of push the case for why a greater level of professionalism is needed, and in a way, it's the enormous success, I think, of the England team in 2009, where they win the 50-over World Cup, then the 20-over World Cup at home. They then retain the Ashes, and they whitewash Australia in their ODI series. And it's kind of this incredible kind of success of the England team under Charlotte Edwards that year that allows Claire Connor to then make the case to people like Giles Clarke, for example, and say, oh, actually, we could really do with contracts if we want to sustain this success. And this success, by the way, is really good.
Handily, you can also look at Australia and be like, guys.
That's true. And Australia did invest significantly in their women's team in 2013. But it's often forgotten that the ECB were the first nation that we were ahead of Australia in actually saying these are professional contracts. And so we kind of won that race, but we then fell behind in terms of professionalising what was underneath. Australia well ahead of us there. And that's why we're in a situation where they then win the Ashes 16-0. But yeah, so I think that there's an argument going on within the ECB, but it's almost predicated on the England women's cricket team being successful, and that's a problem, because that then leads to what you've just described, which is, well, we've given them contracts, so now we expect them to instantly win everything, and that's just clearly nonsense. And I think in retrospect, also, the players themselves were not prepared for what professionalism meant. So that's another kind of issue with just suddenly saying to players overnight, by the way, you're now a professional, and then not thinking about what that means for them, like psychologically, what that transition period is actually going to be like. How do they respond when journalists say to them, well, you're a pro now, so why have you lost this test match? And all of those kind of things. I think that we think of professionalism as this great step of progress for women's sport, but we don't necessarily think about the nuances of it. And that, I mean, we saw that as well after that recent Women's Ashes series, which England obviously did terribly in. Some of the conversations around that still carried a degree of sexism, because if you probably should never go below the line on and read comments on the BBC, for example. But some of the comments are basically like men saying, well, why are we paying these women all this money? They're rubbish. And it's a totally different conversation to the one we should be having, which is it's absolutely fine to critique them and say, sorry, Amy Jones, you played a crap shot there. Like, you really messed up that run chase because you forgot.
So why are you dropping catches that are lobbed to you at cover?
Yeah, exactly. And that's fine. But that's nothing to do with them being women and everything to do with them being elite cricketers that we can now have high expectations of.
It also completely ignores the fact that, what you were talking about earlier with the fact that Australian players coming up through the system can actually be paid and resourced like they're actual elite athletes, and so by the time they get to the Australian team, they're ready. One of the things that you were talking about associations earlier, and one of the things that jumped into my head was you talking about Australian domestic players getting contracts. The Australian Players Union is really powerful. It's really united between the men and the women, and they have revenue sharing like they do in American sports. The PCA is not that.
Mm. Yeah, and the PCA actually, the PCA was sort of a little bit between a rock and a hard place for quite a long time, because the England team were not members of the PCA because they were not professional. So therefore they had nobody to represent their interests. Obviously, eventually they become PCA members because they are professional, but then the domestic players have had nobody to represent their interests. So it's really only in the last 5 years that the PCA are actually properly giving women's cricket a voice in terms of trying to advocate for their interests. And so they're almost, the PCA are having to play catch up a bit, I think, because of the way that the model works is, well, you're only a PCA member if you're a professional cricketer. And until 5 years ago, we only had 20 of those. So that's led to a kind of a quite right and overdue rebalancing of what the PCA is trying to do, I think. Although there's still a thorny question of, actually, ultimately, if we want equal pay, maybe you actually need to take some of the money from the men and give it to the women.
Which is what the Australian men's team did a few years ago with the distribution of the TV money.
Yeah, but that is completely unpalatable to the PCA, whose membership must be still like 75% male. So that's an interesting battle that may yet have to be fought.
Everyone needs a union. I cover a lot of Indian cricket. My God, Indian cricket needs a union. I don't think it's ever going to happen. But I'm interested. We sort of no conversation of this length can never sum up the book. Everyone buy The Women in White's Pitch Publishing. It's excellent. I read it in one sitting. Outstanding. there, just to finish off, there were. I like a book that I always like when a book, even on a subject I know something about. You know, about cricket. No, and I've trying to make my living in it, but I'm certainly not an expert on women's cricket to the extent that you are. I like when a story gives me a book, gives me a story that I'm angry I didn't know about before. Like, how did no one? And there's a couple that jump out here. Claire Taylor being a Claire without an I Taylor being a football and cricket World Cup participant before Release Perry. Charlotte Edwards going from quick cricket to England under 19 in a year, which is the kind of thing that, like, that's something like a Pakistani fast bowler does. Someone spots her, like, I like that. I like that. In Back to the Future, where the band guy rings up and says, Chuck, I think I found your sound. The sports psychologist, again, like, at almost the same time, Robin Smith on the men's team is saying to Keith Fletcher, I need a sports psychologist. And Keith Fletcher is saying, if you need a psychiatrist, you shouldn't be playing for England. And Sharon Ayres, basically building Hampshire women's cricket from the ground up. Were there any stories that you... Obviously, this has been a research interest of yours and a journalistic and personal obsession of yours for a very long time. Were there any stories that you came across that either you didn't know or you thought you knew and you knew differently, or you're like, why on earth is this not better known?
Oh, there's so many. I think we've already talked about the kind of the sort of more nuanced story around that 1976 match at Lord's, for example, because I knew that that's when the women had first played there, but I didn't understand the kind of machinations behind it. You just mentioned the Ruth Prideaux who was the kind of, she was actually the first ever coach of the England women's cricket team, appointed in 1988, and going to interview her and kind of hearing her story was a real privilege, actually, because she was this like incredibly kind of pioneering coach, who sort of built a lot of the foundations of modern cricket coaching.
Yeah, there's some real echoes in her fitness drive of what Mark Robinson did and what Charlotte Edwards did when they first came into the role.
Yeah, and some of the quotes that she said like really jump out at me. She described the England team before she got hold of them as very fish and chip girls, which is just a great summation. And so one of the things she was just trying to do was say, look, actually, if you eat a few more vegetables, then that will have an impact on your cricket. You don't think it will, but it will. If you actually kind of run up and down Eastbourne Beach enough times, because they didn't have money to access a gym, for example, then that will help your fitness and that will really help you. And the sports psychology thing is brilliant. To actually have them all in a classroom, just stood up going, we're going to win the World Cup, is like, at the time, as you say, people in men's cricket just thought that was nonsense.
As did, as you say, a couple of the women's players.
Yeah, they did. They did. Joe Chamberlain was particularly kind of sceptical about this. And then they go into the 1993 World Cup, which is what this has all been building up to. And halfway through, they're on the verge of like crisis point of being knocked out. And they have this crunch match against Australia. And beforehand, they all sit down with the sports psych, and he kind of talks to them and goes through everything they need to do, and they win this match against Australia, which is totally upsetting the odds because everyone thought Australia was going to win that 93 World Cup, and they were the reigning champions, and England knocked them out. And then England get to the final against New Zealand and they win the final. And it's this amazing day for women's cricket. And loads of the players go to Ruth Prideaux afterwards and say, it's all because of the sports psychology. That's why we won. There's another great story during the World Cup where they arrived at their accommodation, which was actually, it was Surrey University Halls in Guildford. And England and Australia and a couple of the other teams were all being put up in these halls of residence. And England got there first. And England had been put on the ground floor and Australia had been put on the first floor. And Ruth Prideaux says, no, we're not having that. That's against all of our sports psychology principles because they'll be on top of us. So she just insisted that England have the rooms on the first floor so that they would feel that they were on top of Australia. which I think is a kind of great illustration of the sort of strength with which she held those principles about psychology being important. But she won the World Cup. England won the World Cup, and it was so much driven by her. And yet, not very many people, certainly not enough people, know her name. And so that's one thing that I hope that the book can do is bring some of these women into the spotlight and give them some of the credit that they deserve.
You talk about hoping that that'll come out of the book. What We're in a strange time in some ways for English women's cricket. We've had the women's 100, the men's. Not to keep comparing it to the men, but with the 100, it's kind of hard not to. The men's 100 still feels like it's halfway between a real tournament and a day out. The women's 100 is an elite level competition, but it's sort of, you had to kill the Super League to do it, and the jump between counties to regions and back again, and how it sort of messed things up a little bit. I've covered covered a county cup game earlier this year at Northants, and against Herefordshire, and the Herefordshire team basically turn up with two support staff,
Yeah.
the coach, and one of who literally does everything else, including writing down the team sheet. And one of the players had to leave early, so they had to slightly finagle the toss, and things like that. Or there was a fear that might happen. It didn't end up happening. And this is a county game in 2026, and where do you? It doesn't. It certainly doesn't seem like we're going to turn back the clock on mixed, on sort of all being under one umbrella governance wise. Where do you want women's cricket to go? Where do you see it going? And what role do you think that this book can play in that?
I think that the book's important because what it's trying to do is reframe this idea that unfortunately some people still hold, that cricket is a men's sport. And actually, what the book does is show that women have been playing cricket just as long as men have. And the only reason that we are where we are is because of this sort of 19th century Victorian crackdown where, cricket somehow became framed as something that women shouldn't do. And we're still kind of recovering from that.
Muscular, masculine Christian colonialism.
Exactly. Women's proper places at home, being good little wives and raising children, and being very quiet and, not out there participating in vigorous physical activity, basically. So actually, what I hope that the book, or the contribution that I hope the book can make is to reshape that idea of cricket as a kind of male sport. It's not. It never has been. It was just that a few blokes in the 19th century thought that. It's about validating women's and girls' place in cricket. And so that's the sort of contribution I hope it can make. We are still at a point where I think participation levels particularly are kind of, it's changing, but there's still a lot more boys and men playing cricket than there are girls and women, unfortunately. So we need to push for kind of gender parity and participation. That's really important. And it needs to be just as easy if you're a woman to rock up at a local club and there be a team for you. And some women happy playing mixed cricket. Some women would rather play in a women's team. So we need to be catering for kind of both of those opportunities. Until we get to that, then we haven't achieved kind of equality. So that's important. And then at the elite end, I don't think it's out of the realms of possibility that women's cricket could still run itself, actually. And I think what we need to be pushing for is to kind of make it so that, for example, we want our own TV deal. We're at a point now where women's cricket can stand on its own 2 feet and push for its own share of TV revenue. If we can get to that point, then we've got our own source of income, and it would be possible for us to run ourselves. It may be that it's more of a kind of there's an umbrella organisation like the ECB or the ICC, and then underneath that you have a men's and a women's arm. But each of those arms would then have kind of equitable levels of resourcing. I don't think that's out of the realms of possibility. If you ask me, like in an ideal world, what would I be pushing for? It would be that.
Having worked at not at any kind of executive level, but at a broadcaster, like there's almost more cricket than well, there is more cricket than you can actually broadcast. So actually, I can see ways of that working, even if it is invest into live stream capacity, and if you've got a multi-camera live stream with directors and stuff like that. And I'm not just pushing for this because I'm a freelance commentator and would like some work. That is a happy accident, but that is something that again, another theme of reading this book and the experience of reading this book as a cricket nut but not a specialist is something I hadn't thought of and will go away and think of. And I think the best sort of review I can give of that is I could have done another interview of this length with you about this book and asked a completely different set of questions. Women in White, Women in Whites, A History of Women's Cricket in England by Dr. Raf Nicholson, although you don't put that on the front cover, by Pitch Publishing. Raf, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Knuckle.